He was one of the most feared rulers in history. Ivan the Terrible, the first Tsar of all the Russias.
He was a torturer, a murderer, a rapist.
Definitely a psychopath.
But legend says the ruthless tyrant had a secret. A library of priceless books hidden in the labyrinth beneath the Kremlin.
Ivan the Terrible's library is really one of the great underground myths.
The mythical library contained the greatest lost works of ancient literature. In the 20th century, one man set out to prove it really existed.
If it was discovered, it would transform our knowledge of the past.
It was a journey into the darkest terrors of the Soviet Union.
Stiletsky was really a man bordering on obsession.
He also had to be brave, of course.
His terrifying enemy, the forces of Stalin's secret police.
Stiletsky was crazy. You don't go looking for secrets in the Soviet Union.
It was a deadly treasure hunt, where the ultimate prize was knowledge.
We are talking about a man who is seriously prepared to risk his life.
This is the story of the quest for Ivan the Terrible's library. The legend of Ivan the Terrible's library began far from Russia, in 15th century Constantinople. The capital of the Byzantine Empire was the dazzling center of European culture.
It is the power engine that drives Christian Europe. This is a world where there is a real premium on scholarship and on learning.
One of the city's greatest treasures was said to be its magnificent library, home to priceless masterpieces of ancient Greek and Roman literature. Legend says the books were bound in gold.
In those days, of course, books were extremely valuable.
Books typically would be encrusted by jewels or would have beautiful decorations on them that were objects of enormous beauty as well as of scholarship.
But in 1453, the empire fell to Muslim invaders.
It's a heartbreaking moment. Churches being converted into mosques, books disappearing, jewels being sacked, men and women being pressed into slavery. The whole story is a very difficult and painful one.
To escape the dying city, the emperor's niece, Sophia, was married to a Russian prince. The legend says that 800 precious books went with her to Moscow.
The books that Sophia brought over, if they were discovered now, would probably triple the volume of Greco-Roman literature available to us.
But it was Sophia's grandson who created the legend of the library. In 1547, Ivan the Terrible became the Tsar of Russia. He was a tyrant and sadist who reveled in bizarre forms of torture.
He only ever laughed when observing tortures. He would have people skinned alive, for example. They would be put into boiling water and then into ice water, and then their skin would be just pulled off.
But despite his cruelty, Ivan was a man of learning and sophistication.
Knowledge-hungry person, ahead of his times, you know. Multilinguist, polymath.
Poet, a musician, a theologian, a philosopher, and he established the first printing press in Russia.
According to legend, the scholarly Ivan took extreme measures to guard his precious library. He hid it away, deep beneath the Kremlin. In a man-made labyrinth of tunnels, formed by sealing off Moscow's underground rivers. The secret location of the library changer was known only to a trusted few. But Ivan's reign descended into paranoia. No one was safe, not even his own family.
The legend says that Ivan killed anyone who knew of the secret location of the library. He even murdered his son.
Finally, Ivan himself died during a game of chess. He took his greatest secret to the grave.
And that looked like the end of the line. Everybody who knew about the library and the places where it could have been hidden was now dead.
By the 20th century, there was no evidence that the library had ever existed. Most Russian academics thought it was a legend and nothing more. But in 1912, an ambitious archaeologist set out to prove them wrong.
He didn't think it was just any old mystery. He believed with every fiber of his body that the library actually existed and that he was going to find it.
Ignaty Stiletsky was raised in the Ukraine, but he learned his trade in the ancient city of Jerusalem. While exploring its warren of underground caves and tunnels, he'd first heard tell of the legend of Ivan's library. It brought him to Moscow and put his subterranean skills to the ultimate test.
Stiletsky solved mysteries by digging.
Stiletsky used to tap his way along the walls, trying to listen for change in the sound, in the resonance of the rock that may have indicated a cavity or space behind that he could dig into.
Stiletsky thought the academics of the Russian establishment were afraid to get their hands dirty. Finding Ivan the Terrible's library was a job for a seasoned underground expert.
It must have been like a red flag to a bull, really. When the establishment tell you that it doesn't exist, that must be incredibly exciting for an ambitious, pushy young scholar.
It was his obsession throughout his adult life to find that library.
Stiletsky planned to dig beneath the walls of the Kremlin. But his first step was to target the likeliest location where Ivan might have hidden his library.
The research you do before going underground is the intellectual challenge. It's a puzzle. You're trying to put the pieces together. The final piece of the puzzle is the dig, is going underground itself.
Stiletsky's starting point was a map of the Kremlin that charted the building in the 16th century. A sprawling citadel of towers, cathedrals, and military buildings.
Kremlin is a mini-city. Like so many fortified towns in the West, it was supposed basically to harbor the whole population of the town with all the infrastructure in place.
Finding the library was a daunting task. The Kremlin covered an area of more than 3 million square feet. But by piecing together snippets of information, Stiletsky created a second and far more specialized map. It was a rough outline of the Kremlin's vast and ancient network of underground tunnels. Ivan had used it to hide his library and to hide himself in times of trouble.
There were lots of tunnels built for security reasons, because those were not vegetarian times in Russian history, and there were frequent uprisings in which everybody would be cut to little pieces.
Stiletsky noticed that the tunnels seemed to converge beneath one of the Kremlin's most famous landmarks. He decided that this building, the Arsenal Tower, would be his #1 target in the quest for Ivan's library.
The Arsenal Tower was probably the most prominent one, and it was also the most likely place under which the treasure could be hidden.
Stiletsky looked deeper into the tower's history, and it soon became clear that he was on the right track.
Streletsky discovered he wasn't the first man to dig under the Arsenal Tower in the Kremlin.
In the 18th century, the Russian nobleman Prince Mikhail Sherbatov had blazed a trail for Streletsky to follow. Beneath the Arsenal Tower, he discovered a gateway to the secret labyrinth beyond. Exploring further, he found the tunnels were lined with distinctive white stone. Sherbatov never found Ivan's library, but his story gave Streletsky vital clues.
Streletsky definitely thought he could do better than Sherbatov because Sherbatov never did find the library and Streletsky thought he would.
Streletsky now knew he had to find Sherbatov's gate. If he could break through it, a labyrinth of white stone would mark the way to the library.
Streletsky thought that every time he could see a white stone, he is on the right track.
Streletsky was ready to search the Kremlin, but he'd be taking his life in his hands. In 1912, revolution was in the air. Ruthless oppression by the Tsar Nicholas II had earned him the nickname Bloody Nicholas. His fearsome secret police had the Kremlin under tight control.
Throughout the reign of Nicholas II, there was a very real danger of revolutionary outbursts. I mean, his own grandfather was blown in half by a bomb. So he had a secret police, and therefore anybody digging in the darkness of tunnels under Kremlin was bound to be seen as at least a potential subversive.
Streletsky hit on a subterfuge. He offered to do an archaeological survey of the Arsenal Tower's basement. His team were kept under close supervision, with the deeper levels of the building strictly out of bounds. But Streletsky waited for the guards and workers to take their lunch break, then slipped out of sight.
He realized only too well that by doing so he was risking his life. But for someone who is obsessed, this can actually be an attraction.
There was an iron stairwell leading deep below the tower. To Streletsky's amazement, Sherbatov's gate was at the bottom. The ancient bars were rusted through. The hunt for the library chamber was on.
For Streletsky, it was a challenge. Here he could test his skills.
Streletsky had to work fast before his absence was noted. And exploring further, his attention was drawn to the floor. Scraping away layers of gravel and earth, he made a tantalizing discovery. There was a cavity which revealed the secret labyrinth below. But there was no time to find a way down.
He still had some common sense left. Doing so would mean an immediate arrest.
Streletsky got back in the nick of time. To investigate the tunnels in safety, he knew he would need official permission.
The Kremlin, after all, is a fortress, and it always has been. You need to have the benediction of the ruling elite to be allowed anywhere near, and to go and look and see what's there.
But the academic establishment was blocking Streletsky's way. Its most eminent figure was Professor Sergei Belyakurov.
Belyakurov was that sort of scientist, Russian scientist, let's say it, who were always very careful, not to raise their head above water, because in Russia, the moment you raise your head above water, it gets hit.
Belyakurov had written an official report dismissing the library as a myth. So there would be no digging in the Kremlin unless Streletsky came up with hard evidence of the library's existence.
Belakurov was a real authority on the subject. So as far as the Russian scientists were concerned, the matter was closed. I mean, there was no library, and that was it.
Strzelecki vowed to prove them all wrong.
Faith is important, and that is part of Strzelecki's crusade, really. It's motivated by a deep belief that these books really did exist once upon a time, and that they can be found.
Strzelecki planned to reinvestigate a key story from Belakurov's report. In the 16th century, an Estonian scholar named Johann Veterman had reputedly seen the library itself. Ivan the Terrible had invited him to translate its ancient masterpieces from the original Greek and Latin. But having learned the secret of the library, Veterman was now in fear for his life.
He was a clever man, and he was terrified.
Ivan the Terrible has a truly terrible reputation, and he's renowned for acts of extraordinary cruelty.
Veterman pretended to start his task, then made good his escape from Moscow. But not before making a list of all the books he could remember. Veterman's list had supposedly resurfaced in 19th century Estonia, but had now disappeared. Belakurov thought the story was fiction. Strzelecki aimed to prove it was fact.
He didn't believe Belakurov's conclusions.
Strzelecki headed 500 miles from Moscow to the last known location of Veterman's list. The town library in Perno, one of the oldest towns in Estonia. But after years of neglect, its storerooms were in disarray.
It was a mess. Everything was scattered around, and actually quite a lot of effort was needed to find what he was looking for.
You can imagine that this library was chock full of nuts, meaning scrolls, rolls, books, scraps of paper. Things were by no means easy to find there.
Strzelecki was drowning in a sea of dusty books and reams of paper. He didn't even know what Veterman's list would look like.
But because Strzelecki was convinced he was going to find the catalog, he kept digging and digging and digging and digging.
The breakthrough finally came when a tattered fragment of paper caught Strzelecki's eye. It was a string of illustrious names, and the list was initialed with the Russian form of the letter V.
The letter V at the bottom, which could mean only one thing: Veterman. Eureka, he found it.
Strzelecki was dumbfounded. Veterman's list was a roll call of the greatest authors of antiquity.
Veterman's list is one of those sort of totally unbelievable lists. Every treasure that we don't have in Latin and Greek literature is on it.
The list contained 100 unknown volumes of Livy's histories of the Roman Empire. And there were lost works of ancient Greek drama.
The idea that we could find plays by Aristophanes that aren't known about or are known but are lost, I mean, it's unbelievable.
Finally, Veterman listed missing pages from the 12 biographies of Caesar by the historian Suetonius.
It looks like a list of what a historian would like to find if he was let into the great sweet shop of history.
If Strzelecki could find Ivan's library, he would literally change human history.
It would transform our knowledge of the past. I mean, I think you'd lick your chops if you had any hope of catching a few pages of one of these texts. The idea that you might find all of them together, it's astonishing.
But now Stiletsky made a fateful mistake. He left Vetterman's list behind and took his own copy back to Moscow, certain that no one could now stand in his way.
If you have a catalogue, it proves that Belokurov was wrong and Stiletsky was right.
But to Stiletsky's disbelief, he still couldn't find a historian who would take him seriously. No one would risk their reputation on a scrap of paper. Stiletsky didn't even have the original list in his hands.
Stiletsky had been given the chance of a lifetime, and he bungled it.
Access to the Kremlin was denied. And there was no second chance. In 1914, Russia was hurled into World War I. Swept up in the tide of history, Stiletsky was banished from Moscow and sent to the front.
The war was a disaster for Russia and for the Tsar.
The Tsar was badly prepared for conflict. Entire Russian armies were annihilated. At home, the country exploded into violent revolution. For ordinary people, the only priority was survival.
When the Bolshevik Revolution swept through Russia, Russia was essentially destroyed. I mean, millions were dying or starving to death or emigrating. Great historical buildings were being razed to the ground.
In the turmoil, Stiletsky's quest for Ivan the Terrible's library was totally irrelevant.
With that kind of cataclysm unfolding, a lowly little library was of little interest to anybody, and Stiletsky must have feared that that was it.
Who cares about the library, even it was the Tsar's library? Who cares about books? Books were only good for throwing into the oven to make yourself warm.
The victorious Bolsheviks murdered the Tsar and took power in Moscow. For ordinary citizens, the times were more dangerous than ever.
The Bolsheviks, they were ready to see counter-revolution everywhere.
For 7 years, Stiletsky kept his head down. His obsession with the Kremlin could only attract deadly suspicion.
He was still an archaeologist, but now he had to become a careful archaeologist. Anybody dealing with the Bolsheviks had to be good at playing the game, because the bad players get shot.
Stiletsky's only chance of survival was to adapt to the new Soviet Union.
Stiletsky realizes that to be able to carry on with this project, he has to become what in modern terms we call politically correct.
In 1924, Stiletsky was ready to renew his quest by campaigning in the communist newspapers. He claimed that underground exploration would reveal the treasures of Russia and give them back to the people.
He wanted to sound like a good Marxist, taking treasures from the rich and giving them back to the poor.
Stiletsky proclaimed, "The time has come to turn underground Moscow inside out." His timing was perfect. The communists themselves were already digging up the city. The new Moscow metro would make Russia the envy of the world. It was the ultimate expression of Soviet power under its sinister new leader, Joseph Stalin.
There was now a new Tsar in the Kremlin named Joseph Stalin, and he wanted to immortalize his Tsardom by building the greatest engineering works known to man, which is the underground network under the city known as the Moscow Metro.
Streletsky was made an official archaeologist on the metro excavations. His task? To assess any unexpected discoveries by the engineers. The tunnels were full of the flotsam and jetsam of Moscow's ancient history. Shards of pottery had somehow found their way down from the city's kitchens. But secretly, Streletsky was hunting for bigger game. Ivan the Terrible's library.
Streletsky thought he probably could latch on to the tail end of that project and do his own thing.
The metro was extending Moscow's ancient labyrinth with 50 miles of new tunnels. They even penetrated beneath the Kremlin itself. Whenever he had the chance, Streletsky listened for hollow walls and the library chamber. But with Stalin's agents everywhere, he was playing a very dangerous game.
This was really very brave, dicing with death. He was now at the very heart of the system, swarming with secret policemen.
Stalin ruled the Soviet Union by terror. By the late 1920s, he was gathering all the reins of power in his own hands. His image and statues dominated the streets. All opposition was ruthlessly hunted down by his vast network of secret police.
Stalin is generally believed to be paranoid. He lived in constant fear of assassination.
Anyone working beneath the Kremlin would be under suspicion. And as Streletsky homed in on the Arsenal Tower, his finds were turning sinister. The workers were terrified to discover skeletons beneath their shovels, unidentified victims of some ancient crime. For Streletsky, it was a daily reminder of Moscow's violent past.
It was very dangerous to keep doing what he was doing, but nevertheless he kept listening, kept putting his ears to the walls and listening and listening and listening, risking his life every single moment.
By 1933, Stalin had assumed total control of the Communist Party. The rule of law was replaced by the word of a single man. Stalin now had the power of life and death over every citizen of the Soviet Union.
No one was immune from disappearing from the street or from one's flat in broad daylight or at night. No one, not even the people who shouted louder than everyone else, "Long live Comrade Stalin."
In this terrifying climate, Streletsky's chance to find the library finally arrived. Word came through of a serious accident underground, close to the Arsenal Tower. Streletsky raced to the scene. The metro excavations had caused a massive collapse, all the way through to street level. But for Streletsky, it was a godsend. Because the collapsing tunnel walls had also revealed a hidden passage. Streletsky was certain they had broken through to Ivan's secret labyrinth. But when he finally got there, he was desperate to investigate. But the workers wouldn't let him come near. The collapse had brought Moscow to a standstill. Stalin's henchmen in the Kremlin couldn't move their cars.
That's a very serious, one would say potentially lethal problems for the engineers, because one thing they have to do, above all, is to keep the traffic flowing for the party bosses in the Kremlin.
The terrified engineers were racing to repair the damage.
They didn't care much about secret passageways. What they did care about was staying alive.
There was nothing Streletsky could do. Stalin's men were in control.
Staletsky was absolutely devastated. That was the chance he had been waiting for so long, and now it looked like he had lost it.
Staletsky's dream was in tatters. The breakthrough was sealed for good.
That must have been a shattering blow to Staletsky. So near, yet so far.
Right then, Staletsky decided to stake his life on one last desperate gamble. Somehow, he had to get Stalin's regime to back his quest for the library. And he realized that Ivan the Terrible himself could show him the way. Staletsky planned to exploit a curious story about the Tsar. During Ivan's reign in the 16th century, he'd made frequent trips to the forests west of the Kremlin. His companions were trusted members of his personal bodyguard. But they would come back from the woods alone, with an unbelievable tale to tell.
Ivan wanted to cultivate an awesome, almost supernatural image.
According to the story, Ivan would simply vanish, as if by magic. He would later reappear in the Kremlin palaces, as if nothing had happened.
He did want people to believe he had almost demonic powers and could vanish in thin air and appear out of thin air.
Staletsky knew better, of course. Ivan had used a secret tunnel to spirit himself away. Staletsky published the story in a Moscow newspaper. Ivan's tunnel was clearly a dangerous breach in Stalin's security, and Staletsky claimed only he could find it.
He's now going for broke. He decides to make all his findings public. That was really like playing hide and seek with death.
He's really burning his bridges all over the place, and they're ablaze. There's really no way back.
It was a message Stalin's henchmen couldn't ignore, and it wasn't long before they had Staletsky in their sights.
The voice there says, "Comrade Staletsky, your digging in the tunnels is starting to disturb us."
The menacing voice on the line was one of Stalin's most ruthless security chiefs. Rudolf Peterson was the commandant of the Kremlin itself, a brutal enforcer with the power of life and death.
He was responsible for the continuing good health of the Soviet leaders. That job was frightening for him, and he himself was a very frightening man. He personally would butcher people.
Peterson wanted to know all the secrets of the Kremlin's past. Terrified, Staletsky told him about Ivan the Terrible's library and the tunnels leading from the Arsenal Tower. But then Peterson gave him the surprise of his life.
He was afraid of being arrested. But, like it often happens in Russian history, a sudden, unexpected turn of events. Instead of that, he was given a carte blanche for excavations under the Kremlin and even access to the Arsenal Tower.
Peterson wanted help to find the tunnels and close the breach in Kremlin security. Staletsky could hardly believe his luck.
He told his diary, "I have the bluebird of happiness in my hands. At 10 o'clock on the 13th of November, 1933, I will finally be allowed back into the Kremlin."
More than 20 years after his first visit, Staletsky re-entered the basement of the Arsenal Tower. But this time, there was no need to hide. He had Peterson's blessing and a team of engineers. His mission? To map out the Kremlin's secret tunnels and find Ivan the Terrible's library.
He can't believe his luck. It's like a miracle. He's got the keys to the Kremlin now.
Everything was just as Strzelecki had left it in 1912. But now he could explore in safety. On rediscovering the cavity in the floor, Strzelecki's only thought was to find a way through to the levels below, and Ivan's secret labyrinth of white stone.
There had to be another chamber underneath, made of that same white stone.
The lifelong underground explorer was in his element. This was the breakthrough Strzelecki had always dreamed of. At last, he was about to penetrate the heart of Ivan the Terrible's labyrinth.
I mean, he must have been ecstatic.
Just as he'd expected, the tunnels were lined with white stone. Ivan the Terrible's library was hidden somewhere behind the walls.
He must have been absolutely passionate about trying to find this, as any scholar would do. Every door he opened, every hatch he lifted, every stone he unturned, his heart must have leapt, thinking he'd found things.
Strzelecki then writes a report to the commandant of the Kremlin. The tunnels, which I have been dreaming of for 25 years, have been found. I have broken through 4.5 centuries of mystery.
Strzelecki told Pettersson that it would take months to explore every inch of the tunnels. There was a clear danger from collapsing walls.
Anything can happen in a tunnel that's 400 or 500 years old. The floor can collapse under you, the roof can come in, the props can fall apart because they've rotted through. The risks are huge.
As the weeks passed, Strzelecki's team suffered terrifying accidents. If the worst happened and the roof came down, they were as good as dead.
If you were doing underground exploration, the roof caved in, well, your chance of rescue was pretty slim. And if you're a long way underground, it can take hours for rescuers to get to you, by which time it's game over.
The excavation team soon tired of Strzelecki's relentless quest.
The workers didn't really care about Ivan the Terrible's secret library. Why on earth should they be buried alive, working for this crazy man?
Strzelecki drove himself close to exhaustion, but he had to keep going. He knew that everyone in the Soviet Union was living on borrowed time. By 1934, Stalin's paranoia had reached its peak. He used the death of a key rival, Sergei Kirov, as a pretext for mass murder. In the Great Terror that followed, at least 1 million people died. Under torture, Stalin's old comrades from the revolution confessed to treason. After public show trials, they were brutally executed. In Stalin's Russia, the price of failure was death. In Strzelecki's reports to Commandant Pettersson, he made rash promises that results were just around the corner.
March 2nd, 1934. Everywhere, we see the white stone ceiling of the Kremlin tunnels. The library of Ivan the Terrible is about to be found.
Strzelecki had evidence that he was closing in on Ivan the Terrible's greatest secrets. In the deep recesses of the labyrinth, he'd found old weapons, possibly dating from the late 16th century, a period when Ivan, like Stalin, had slaughtered his enemies in the Kremlin dungeons.
This was at the time of Ivan's Great Terror, when his secret police, their prisoners, were murdering thousands and thousands of his opponents.
The only place more secret than Ivan's dungeons was the library itself. Strzelecki was convinced it had to be nearby.
He says, "I'm sure that I'm on the verge of a great discovery.
Strzelecki pinned his hopes on one last dig through the surrounding walls. The culmination of his lifelong quest. But the result was a catastrophe. Excavations had hardly begun when the workers struck a well directly connected to the underground river nearby.
That must have been a really terrifying moment, all that water starting to pour in to the space he was working in.
Strzelecki's only desperate thought was to find the library and somehow save the books.
At the very point, but he is so close to finding the library he had been looking for so many years, he could have destroyed it himself.
It was a hopeless situation. Strzelecki's team could do nothing except run for their lives.
This is going to be a river, it's an unexhaustible supply of water, and it was really time to get out.
Within reach of his dream, Strzelecki was forced to leave the Kremlin behind. The commandant shut down the excavations.
He has literally undermined the Kremlin, causing damage to the substructure. And Stalin, with his henchmen, were immediately above his head.
Strzelecki is now very close to a total mental and physical breakdown. The aim of his life seems to be out of reach.
For months, as workers labored to repair the damage, Strzelecki was forced to wait at home. He was living in fear, not just for himself, but for Ivan the Terrible's library.
Strzelecki is terrified that the library will flood, or else that the workers might seal off some of the vital passageways.
He says the sword of Damocles is hanging over the library of Ivan the Terrible.
Strzelecki was hoping against hope that somehow he could survive the disaster and pick up his quest.
The only thing that can save him now is a phone call from the Kremlin, from Peterson, saying to him to carry on with his excavations.
And then the phone call comes.
But the man on the line wasn't Peterson. There was a new commandant in the Kremlin.
In 1935, in Stalin's Russia, this could only mean one thing. Peterson was as good as dead.
In the Great Terror, Stalin saw every high-ranking official as a rival. Peterson had too much power to be allowed to live.
For that crime, there was no reprieve. A bullet in the back of the neck was the only possible punishment.
In the chaos of the Great Terror, Strzelecki himself disappeared from history. In the worst-case scenario, he too had been executed, or had simply vanished into Stalin's prison camps, like countless others.
They disappeared all the time, and they would just walk out of their house to buy a loaf of bread, never to be seen again. Had someone like Strzelecki disappeared, I mean, it would have been completely unnoticed.
In the late 1950s, after Stalin's death, the mystery of Strzelecki's whereabouts was finally solved. A Moscow journalist rediscovered Strzelecki's diaries. They detailed his lifelong struggle through the upheavals of Russian history and his early years training as an archaeologist in Jerusalem, the ancient city where Strzelecki first learned of the sacred texts in the libraries of Ivan the Terrible.
I think that's really where he got the bug, and which drove him on to look for Ivan the Terrible's library.
For the first time, the diaries revealed that Strzelecki had a family. The journalists tracked them down at his last known address on an old Moscow street.
It was right by the Kremlin, within view of the Arsenal towers.
Stiletsky's wife filled in the last tragic chapter in his story. Thwarted in his quest, Stiletsky had filled their home with his strange underground finds. A broken man, he'd cocooned himself in the secrets of the Kremlin.
This sort of obsession, which is probably bordering on madness, you know, that's the Russian scientist for you, you know.
At the end, Stiletsky's mind seemed to have failed. He was losing the ability to even communicate.
Shortly before his death, as his wife later recalled, he started mumbling and bumbling something incoherent.
But this story gave the journalist an amazing idea. Remembering Stiletsky's work in Jerusalem, he tried speaking a few words of Arabic to Stiletsky's puzzled wife.
And she suddenly remembered one word. That's it, she said. That's what he said, maktaba. Maktaba.
Stiletsky had not been babbling. He knew exactly what he was trying to say.
Maktaba is the Arabic for library.
Stiletsky believed in the library to his dying breath. In his own mind, he was still on the quest. And in modern Moscow, his legend lives on.
Moscow has a very active community of underground explorers called the Moscow Diggers. And of course, they're still looking for the fabled legend of Ivan the Terrible's library as well.
The Diggers are still playing Stiletsky's old game of hide-and-seek with the rulers in the Kremlin. They're still on the hunt for the lost library of Ivan the Terrible.
Just because Stiletsky never found Ivan the Terrible's library doesn't mean that it doesn't exist.
The library of lost masterpieces may still be waiting to rewrite the pages of history.
I do believe that Ivan the Terrible's library existed and still exists and still can be found.
I have absolutely no doubt in my mind that it did exist.
Ignatiy Stiletsky may one day receive his final vindication. He is Britain's most famous monarch. King Arthur, legendary commander of the Knights of the Round Table. Armed with the mighty sword Excalibur.
We'll never tire from hearing the stories of King Arthur.
His name is a byword for honor and courage.
He's a legendary figure, a war leader par excellence.
In the 20th century, two archaeologists set out in search of King Arthur's bones. One was a scientist driven by the facts, who risked ridicule and isolation in his quest.
Here is a man that flies in the face of received wisdom.
The other was obsessed by the supernatural.
What Bligh was doing was increasingly odd.
It was a journey that took them into the darkest part of England's dark Middle Ages. This is the story of the quest for King Arthur's grave. King Arthur is one of the most famous characters in the history of the British Isles. According to legend, his spectacular reign dates to the 6th century AD.
The popular image of King Arthur is of a knight in shining armour with a round table heroic knights who go on quests, especially for the Holy Grail.
King Arthur is truly the stuff of legend. There's the famous story of the young Arthur drawing the sword from the stone, and his many magical adventures with the wizard Merlin. But the real King Arthur is shrouded in mystery, because the 6th century was at the heart of the Dark Ages. Few facts about this period of history are known. The peoples of Britain were under attack by foreign invaders. According to legend, King Arthur was their defender and champion. But his story ends with a valiant death in battle.
Arthur wins a whole series of battles before being fatally wounded in a climactic last battle with his archenemy.
Arthur is mortally wounded, and he's then taken to the Isle of Avalon to be healed of his wounds. And that's the last we hear of him.
The Isle of Avalon was the greatest mystery of all. No one knew where Arthur's last resting place actually was.
I think most contemporary scholars would doubt that in historical terms there ever was an Avalon.
But in 1191, 600 years after Arthur's death, the monks of Glastonbury Abbey in the west of England made a stunning discovery. They found King Arthur's grave.
This must have been one of the most celebrated discoveries, well, was the most celebrated discovery of the Middle Ages.
The grave contained a lead cross, identifying the bones as King Arthur's.
When they came to look at the inscription on the lead cross, they read it as saying, "Here lies buried the famous King Arthur in the Isle of Avalon."
The monks of Glastonbury believed their own abbey was Avalon itself. The mystery of King Arthur's death seemed to be solved.
There really was a King Arthur. We've got his tomb exactly in the same way as we've got the tombs of other famous kings.
But for modern historians, it was impossible to tell whether the monk's story was true. Because in 1539, Glastonbury Abbey was totally destroyed by Henry VIII in his power struggles with the Catholic Church. All traces of King Arthur, his bones, and the cross that marked his grave were apparently lost. By the 20th century, scholars were left with no hard evidence that there ever was a real King Arthur.
There's a lot of skepticism about whether King Arthur really existed or did any of the things ascribed to him.
There is nothing that would confirm the existence of a historical figure called Arthur.
But in 1908, there was one man who firmly believed that King Arthur was real. And not only that, he set out to prove it. The brilliant architect, Frederick Bligh Bond, believed that only he could track down King Arthur's last resting place, somewhere in the shattered ruins of Glastonbury Abbey.
The only way we can actually prove whether King Arthur existed, or indeed disprove it, is by tangible archaeological remains.
If you could find a fragment of Arthur's tomb, then your reputation as an archaeologist would be made.
Bligh Bond convinced the Abbey's owners, the Church of England, to allow him access to Glastonbury. But he would still have to prove his credentials.
I think this was too good an opportunity for him to miss. Here was this almost virgin site, remarkably little work is done on it. He's the man to step forward.
In the early 1900s, the science of archaeology was in its infancy. Bligh Bond would use his architectural skills to make the first systematic search of Glastonbury Abbey. But only a few ruined walls remained. So the first step in Bligh Bond's quest was to fill in the gaps, to make a detailed plan of the abbey as it once was.
Bond is, in effect, making a map. He actually stayed on site each day. He took measured drawings of what was found. Now this, of course, sounds very, very basic to our ears today, but this was something that most of his contemporaries simply didn't do.
The magnificent abbey had several major buildings, but if Bligh Bond could map them out, then the historical records gave him a tantalizing clue where Arthur's bones could be found. After finding the grave, the monks had been anxious to display Arthur's remains to important visitors. So they put them in pride of place, at the centre of their largest and most important building, the Abbey Church.
They were brought out in 1278 to be presented to two very interested visitors indeed, King Edward I and his wife, Queen Eleanor of Castile. So they paid for a tomb of black marble to be set out in the middle of the Abbey Church.
The story should have led Bligh Bond straight to King Arthur's tomb. But with the entire site in ruins, the location of the Abbey Church was far from clear. Bligh Bond's problem was to somehow map out its missing walls, then find the tomb at the centre. And to find the solution, he would rely on his lifelong fascination with mathematics.
His first love really is mathematics, and especially mathematical puzzles, numbers, correspondences.
Bligh Bond believed the builders of Glastonbury Abbey had used a secret mathematical code. His measurements showed that the layout of the abbey followed a deliberate number pattern. It had been handed down by architects since biblical times.
According to his measurements, there seemed to be repeating numbers and patterns which were coming out, and these were more than coincidental, but seemed to be a foundation plan, a foundation geometry.
Bligh Bond knew that ancient builders often used number patterns called magic squares. Every square has 6 rows and 6 columns. But to crack the code, Bligh Bond had to find a way to fill in the rows and columns so that they all added up to the same number. He made hundreds of attempts to find the right pattern, until finally he had the solution. The secret magic number was 111. Bligh Bond was convinced that he knew what it meant. 111 multiplied by 8 makes 888 inches, or 74 feet. He believed he had discovered the secret. The ancient builders had laid out the abbey on a grid of 74-foot squares.
Bligh comes to the conclusion that he's discovered the medieval laying out plan of Glastonbury Abbey.
Bligh Bond decided to prove his credentials by putting his map to the test. He would reveal the Abbey's lost buildings one by one. Acting on his instructions, his workers dug a trench exactly 74 feet long. They immediately hit the foundation stones of an entire chapel that no one else knew was there. It had been missing for nearly 400 years. But Bleibond's map had predicted its location. The lost chapel exactly filled the last square of 74 feet.
Bond called it the Lost Chapel because it was the only significant addition to the abbey of which there was no surviving trace. Nothing remained above ground. It was something of a test for Bligh, if you like.
One of England's greatest archaeologists said the lost chapel had never even existed. But Bleibond uncovered it within weeks. He had even predicted its eventual size.
Bond hit foundations, followed them to the east, and discovered a very large four-bay building, thus proving one of the leading archaeologists of the day wrong.
The church authorities were dazzled. This was a man who could predict exactly what he would find before he even started digging.
The discovery of the Lost Chapel, if you like, very clearly marked Bond out as an archaeological force to be reckoned with. Large numbers of visitors came to the Abbey, including people like the Bishop of Bristol, who even commented, "How are you doing it? You know, you don't seem to be wasting a spadeful of earth."
The Lost Chapel was the first square to be filled in on Bleibond's 74-foot grid pattern. His excavations soon revealed that the much larger Abbey church, the last known location of King Arthur's tomb, was also a perfect fit to his master plan. The huge building was 1 square wide and 5 squares long. Bleibond knew exactly where to dig for Arthur's bones, right in the center of the church.
When he's got all that information, then he measures out on the ground and puts his spade into the turf.
If Bleibond's calculations were correct, then the marbled tomb was about to be revealed. And he soon found what he was looking for. Telltale chippings of the distinctive black stone. These were the last remnants of the tomb which had been smashed by King Henry VIII in 1539. If Arthur's remains had also survived, they had to be somewhere nearby. But to Bleibond's utter disbelief, his workers couldn't find a single fragment of bone. For all his ingenuity, Bleibond's search for King Arthur had failed. And at this major setback, his church paymasters started to question his strange obsession with numbers.
There was nothing fundamentally unorthodox about what Bond was doing with number at all. It was just highly unusual.
To the church establishment, magic squares looked like numerology. A practice they connected with the paranormal, even Satanism.
It all sounded extremely dubious. Eyebrows were raised, questions were asked at committee meetings.
The church's patience was running out, and Bleibond needed results, fast. His new plan was to look for the actual grave where the 12th century monks had found King Arthur's remains. It would be one last chance to find any bones the monks had left behind. But Bleibond's map was now useless. The grave could be anywhere in the Abbey's grounds. A total area of 220,000 square feet. To track it down, Bligh Bond was ready for desperate measures.
Bligh is so convinced by his work with symbolic number, and he so desperately wants this to be true that he oversteps the mark.
Bligh Bond turned to the occult. With the help of a psychic named John Bartlett, Bond planned to communicate with the dead. Their seances used the paranormal technique of automatic writing.
They would take out a couple of sheets of clean white paper, they would sit down comfortably, and they would either ask a question into the air or alternatively write a question at the top of a piece of paper. Bartlett would put a pencil in his hand and put his hand on the sheet of paper. Bligh would then take his right hand and put it on Bartlett's left hand in which he was holding the pencil. And after a few hesitant movements, Bartlett's hand would start to write, and scrawl would proceed across the page.
The writing seemed to be guided by an unseen power. For Bligh Bond, it was electrifying. The monks of the ancient abbey were telling him their secrets.
He literally believes in the spirits of medieval monks. Much to Bligh's surprise, a lot of the personalities do seem to be remarkably helpful. In fact, they egg him on. You know, you should dig further, you should look here, you should look there.
A monk named Johannes was the most anxious to be heard. He encouraged Bligh Bond's obsession with mapping out the abbey.
They were interested in mathematics and geometry as well. Bligh gets quite fond of Johannes and often asked for him if he was talking to a different personality.
Totally gripped, Bligh Bond begged for the location of King Arthur's grave. And Johannes had a shocking revelation. There was another, much older church, far beneath the abbey soil. In the search for Arthur's bones, Bligh Bond would have to dig deeper into Glastonbury's Dark Age past.
The very oldest part of Glastonbury Abbey was called the Old Church, the Ecclesia Vetusta. It was extremely ancient, and nobody was quite too sure how old it was or who was the original builder.
According to Johannes, the site of the Old Church was now occupied by the medieval Lady Chapel, which Bligh Bond had already located on his map. King Arthur's grave was just outside in the ancient cemetery. Bligh Bond realized he could use his mathematical knowledge to track it down.
So he thinks to himself, if the same ground plan has been used through the centuries, we can project backwards in time, exploring the geometry and the buildings, to find the form of the very first church.
Bligh Bond mapped out his search zone around the old church. Still obsessed by the number 6, he formed a hexagon. The cemetery and King Arthur's grave had to be somewhere within the symbolic shape. When his excavations began, Bligh Bond could hardly believe his eyes. There were bones everywhere. He had found the ancient cemetery, filled with centuries of the abbey's inhabitants. It was only a matter of time before he identified the grave of King Arthur.
He was quite convinced that he had discovered the original gravesite of Arthur and Guinevere, and that if he had had the season to dig, he would have been able to excavate the original grave cut.
But now, Bligh Bond made his greatest mistake. In 1918, he published a book called The Gate of Remembrance. It detailed his paranormal investigations at Glastonbury Abbey and revealed his seances with dead monks. The news spread like wildfire through the Church of England.
As you can imagine, this created something of a stir. The accusation was that Bligh wasn't an objective architect and archaeologist. How could he be? And that it wasn't Bligh who was director of excavations, but in fact it was the personalities of medieval monks that were actually directing what was going on site.
In the eyes of the church, Bligh Bond was flirting with the devil, not Christian archaeology. The clincher for them was that 6 rows of 111 make 666. The number of the beast.
This is the moment which the excavations are closed down and his services are no longer required.
Bligh Bond's quest for the bones of King Arthur was over. The horrified church shut down the excavations. In 1923, he was banished from the abbey for good. But a new Arthurian hero was already waiting to take up the quest. In 1908, the excavations at Glastonbury Abbey had been visited by a highly inquisitive 8-year-old boy. From the very start, he seemed destined to take up the quest for King Arthur. His name was Arthur Raleigh Radford. And in Bligh Bond, he found a charismatic mentor.
It seems highly likely that Bligh made quite an impression on the young Radford.
The boy was thrilled by Bond's fantastic stories of ancient monks and a legendary king.
Bligh always used to be the circus master when he took people around his excavations. Excavation work, that was his love, that was his passion, and that came across in everything he did. And that's the sort of thing that I would have thought that would appeal to a young mind.
There and then, young Radford decided to find King Arthur's grave. A quest he would follow for his entire career as the leading archaeologist of Dark Age Britain.
He'd been obsessed by the idea that the Arthurian past had had some archaeological reality.
But Radford had little time for Bligh Bond's paranormal methods. He was very much his own man, careful, logical, and systematic. A skeptic who wanted solid evidence above all else.
One of the things that Raleigh Radford has going for him is he isn't a dreamer. He's not guided by hidden forces or anything like that.
Radford was an extremely serious, earnest scholar. Very critical and very methodical.
He was a proper archaeologist. He wasn't chasing shadows.
But even Radford couldn't get permission to dig at Glastonbury. The Church of England was still wary after its experience with Bligh Bond. So Radford switched the focus of his search from the place of King Arthur's death to the place of his birth. 100 miles from Glastonbury, on the windswept Isle of Tintagel. The setting for the fantastic story that started King Arthur's legend. The story goes that King Arthur's father, Uther Pendragon, had fallen in love with the Duke of Cornwall's wife.
The Duke of Cornwall realised what was going on and so whisked his wife back to Cornwall and put her in the most secure location he could find, Tintagel.
Believing his castle was safe, the Duke made the mistake of leaving his wife at home. But Uther found a miraculous way to gain access.
The answer to an impossible task was to get Merlin the magician.
Merlin worked his magic. He transformed Uther into the exact likeness of the Duke, and he walked straight into the castle unopposed.
Uther Pendragon took the opportunity to sleep with the Duchess of Cornwall, disguised as her husband, then leave in the morning, and then catch up with the real Duke of Cornwall and kill him.
According to the legend, King Arthur was the result.
It was on that very night that King Arthur, the most famous of men, was conceived.
Few archaeologists took this legend seriously. But Radford himself was intrigued by the specific mention of Tintagel. He believed there had to be some reason why the legend was set on the island.
It seems reasonable to suppose there's no smoke without fire. He was pretty sure that following these legendary Arthurian associations could lead you to genuine 5th and 6th century sites.
Radford thought that Tintagel must have been part of a real 6th century Arthurian kingdom. And he planned to prove it with hard archaeological evidence. But he risked making himself a laughingstock. No other archaeologist believed the island had even been inhabited in the 6th century.
When Raleigh Radford started digging at Tintagel, scholarly views were that there was no Dark Age presence on Tintagel at all.
Radford set out to prove them all wrong. By digging deeper into Tintagel's past than anyone had before. He revealed a hidden Dark Age world. Rectangular buildings, laid out like a religious settlement.
He thought he'd identified there a series of characteristics which showed that the site was in fact a 6th century monastery.
Digging into the ruins, Radford found evidence that could precisely date the monastery to King Arthur's 6th century. It was a special type of pottery that had never before been found in Britain.
Here's, I think, a really fascinating element in the discoveries that Radford made at Tintagel, that the pot shards, the pieces of pottery that he was turning up in vast quantities, were not locally made.
The pottery came from the Eastern Mediterranean. It proved that Dark Ages Tintagel was not just a monastery, but an international trading post.
During the 5th and 6th centuries, Tintagel was plainly in contact with traders bringing Eastern Mediterranean imported pottery.
What he's discovered is a sophisticated 6th century world.
Radford called his pottery Tintagelware. It showed what everyone else thought was an empty island had in fact been a thriving community.
Radford's discovery of imported Mediterranean pottery at Tintagel in the 1930s was a turning point for the archaeology of 5th and 6th century Britain.
There he was, uncovering with spade work absolute tangible evidence of this wealthy, sophisticated, international cosmopolitan world in Dark Age Britain. There was absolute groundbreaking, pioneering stuff from a man who absolutely knew what he was doing.
By following up on the King Arthur legend, Radford had proved something that no one else had even suspected. Tintagel had been part of a thriving 6th century Britain, just like the legends of King Arthur had described. Radford believed he had uncovered King Arthur's kingdom. Now he wanted evidence of King Arthur himself.
All it will now take is the opportunity to start digging at sites connected with the rest of the legends of King Arthur.
Radford was ready for Glastonbury Abbey. and the mystery buried somewhere beneath its ancient ruins. In 1951, the church authorities finally gave him permission to excavate. Now all he had to do was find King Arthur's grave. Radford tackled his task like a master detective. He would make a detailed forensic analysis of the key eyewitness account from the 12th century.
What really happened outside Glastonbury Abbey in 1191.
The medieval monks had called in a historian named Gerald of Wales to verify their find of Arthur's grave. Radford planned to put Gerald's evidence under the microscope. Exhibit A was King Arthur himself. Gerald of Wales described his bones as those of an imposing warrior.
He describes how large the shin bones were, how large the eye sockets of this great heroic leader. You can imagine him probably standing 7 foot tall in his stockinged feet.
For Radford, the vital clue was a deep wound in the skull, exactly matching King Arthur's fatal battle wound as described by legend.
The body had several wounds to its head, mostly healed, but the last one, the major wound, was unhealed and presumably had been what had killed him.
Exhibit B was very different. The skeleton of a woman, with long hair still clinging to the skull. It was Queen Guinevere.
One of the monks was so overcome with romantic enthusiasm that he'd got hold of the hank of hair, which unfortunately then turned to dust.
Finally, Exhibit C, a lead cross identifying the skeletons as King Arthur and his wife. Gerald had copied down its ancient inscription.
When they came to look at the inscription on the lead cross, they read it as saying, "Here lies buried the famous King Arthur in the Isle of Avalon with his second wife, Guinevere."
Gerald was sure the monks had found King Arthur's grave. But Raleigh Radford had reason to be sceptical. After the destruction of Glastonbury Abbey, all 3 key pieces of evidence were now missing. And Radford had to consider another, very different interpretation of Gerald's story. The find of King Arthur's grave could have been an elaborate fraud.
There have always been rumours of skullduggery, of deliberate falsification of the evidence. It is absolutely possible that monks could have hoaxed the whole discovery. It really is a kind of medieval scene of the crime mystery.
The monks' motivation for fraud would be financial gain. They were trying to prove they had the rights to their land.
You have to remember that Glastonbury Abbey was one of the biggest landowners in the country back in the 12th century. It was now up to the monks to try and justify why they had all that land.
With King Arthur's body in their possession, the monks could argue that he had granted them a royal charter.
And it could be seen as a seal of approval, a confirmation of some of those charters, if they could find King Arthur's burial.
So at face value, the discovery of King Arthur's grave was suspiciously convenient. Gerald of Wales could have been the unwitting victim of the monk's deception.
They could have found a convenient body and shown it to Gerald of Wales. He was very much the kind of person you'd want to have as a publicist, and he was specifically invited over to Glastonbury Abbey to talk to the monks and look at their discovery.
The inscription on the lead cross, as recorded by Gerald, was the most damning evidence of all. Modern archaeologists had dated the style of the lettering to the 12th century, exactly as if the monks had faked it.
They can create something which, in the context of the time, is a plausible forgery. Can monks really be trusted? Who knows?
Radford was the only archaeologist who believed the monks were telling the truth. He thought the lettering could be much older than the 12th century, and that the cross itself had been genuine. But to prove that Gerald's story was true, Radford had to find the only piece of evidence that was still in existence. The grave itself, still buried somewhere in the Abbey's oldest cemetery. But thanks to Frederick Bligh Bond, he knew exactly where to start his search.
Raleigh Radford had the big advantage that he could follow up the work of Bligh Bond. That gave Raleigh Radford a very good ground plan for the kind of places he was going to have to be digging if he wanted to find King Arthur's tomb.
Radford focused his excavations around the Abbey's old church, the Ecclesia Vetusta. The same place where Frederick Bligh Bond had been digging 40 years before, guided by the spirit of the medieval monk Johannes. But Radford planned a much more scientific approach. Peter Points Wright, an archaeologist on the team, was fired by his enthusiasm.
He was an inspirational character, there with you all the time.
Urged on by Radford, the team dug deeper into the Abbey's ancient cemetery. But they faced the same challenge as Bligh Bond, to somehow identify Arthur's grave amongst many. Radford's vast experience gave him an ingenious way to solve the problem.
His depth of knowledge was, it oozed out everywhere.
Radford's research had uncovered a key historical detail. The site of the old church was now occupied by the medieval Lady Chapel. King Arthur had been buried south of the third window. His grave was directly in between two gigantic pillars.
One was 26 feet high, and one was 19 feet high.
The pillars were stolen after the abbey was destroyed. But Radford thought monuments this size must have left some trace behind. He planned to dig a 60-foot trench to find them.
We worked out where we thought the site was.
The trench took weeks of careful excavation, but then came the breakthrough. The pillars that once marked Arthur's grave had left gaping holes in the ground.
And that gave the exact location, almost X marks the spot, for where he would have to start digging.
Directly between the holes, there were clear signs of disturbed earth. It was an empty grave, exactly where Radford said it would be.
The sort of area you would respectfully put a body into the ground.
Radford and Points Wright soon found more proof that they were digging in the right place. Tiny chippings of stone showed the 12th century monks had also been in the grave.
And they'd been digging down in exactly the same spot.
In 1191, when the monks dug up Arthur's grave, the abbey was under reconstruction. The local building material, Dalting stone, was everywhere. Radford found that some of it had gone into the grave. It was a clear indication that at the time of the building works, the grave had been open.
There was the building chippings from the Ladies' Chapel that was being put up at that time, got down the hole when they'd made the disturbance.
The hole that they'd made had gradually filled up with these chippings as though it had been backfilled.
The stone chippings proved that the monks had definitely dug up the grave in 1191. But their story could still have been a hoax. Radford needed further evidence that the original grave was even older than the 12th century. And when he examined his trench more closely, he found it. There was a foundation wall designed to contain packed earth, and Radford soon discovered its purpose in the Abbey's historical records. Long before 1191, the 10th century abbot of Glastonbury had raised the level of the entire cemetery to venerate its famous occupant.
And he could see that St Dunstan, or Dunstan the abbot of Glastonbury in Anglo-Saxon times, had been reorganising the graveyard at a higher level.
Arthur's grave had been dug up and reburied long before the monks of 1191 rediscovered it. Radford was sure the lead cross came from this 10th century reburial. It was put in the grave to make sure King Arthur was still properly marked. The 12th century monks hadn't faked it.
His theory was this was something which had been made between the time of King Arthur and the discovery of Arthur's grave in 1191.
With evidence to show that the 12th century monks had been telling the truth, Radford was ready to go public. He gave an interview to the BBC.
The monks said that they found in the coffin a leaden cross with a Latin inscription which says, "Here lies Arthur, the famous king in the island of Avalon." That has been dismissed as a forgery. In my view, on the basis of the lettering and the form of the cross, it dates not from the late 12th century, but from the 10th century.
If Radford was right, then the monks really had found King Arthur, the king who had founded their church in the 6th century.
It was traditional in the 12th century to put the founder of your church, your monastery, in a great tomb in the choir. And I have very little doubt that that's what they intended to do.
Radford thought quite definitely that this was the grave from which the bodies of Arthur and Guinevere were removed.
Radford was sure the account by Gerald of Wales was true. The monks had dug up a grave. Radford had found it. It really did happen in 1191. The stone chippings said so. The cross identified King Arthur, and Radford could show it wasn't a fake. There was only one piece of evidence he couldn't find: tintagel-ware, to prove that King Arthur's original burial was in the 6th century.
Radford used imported Mediterranean pottery as the key indicator for sites of the 5th and 6th centuries.
It was one of the few things he didn't find on that excavation. It could well have been that those tintagel-ware fragments had once been there and gone, but the truth was he hadn't found his smoking gun.
Radford knew his evidence was all circumstantial. There was nothing to link the grave directly to King Arthur.
This is where I excavated in 1962 and 63 and found the great hole from which they dug out someone.
Someone?
Well,
Arthur?
I think it was Arthur, but of course I can't prove it.
Radford never did prove the existence of King Arthur. But even at the age of 90, he was still visiting sites like Tintagel, still hoping for that conclusive final piece of missing evidence. He died in 1998, still on his quest.
Personally, I'm very much on the side of Raleigh Radford. He must have been persuaded there was something behind these Arthurian legends.
But Radford's story has a final twist. A decade after his death, archaeologists reassessed his finds at Glastonbury Abbey. They discovered that Radford had in fact found Tintagel ware in the Abbey grounds. Radford never knew it, but he had proof all along that Glastonbury dated back to the 6th century. While most experts still don't believe in King Arthur, Radford was convinced this would have been the heart of his Dark Age kingdom. A fitting last resting place for Britain's greatest legend.
The Honjo Masamune is the ultimate samurai sword. In Japan, it's regarded as a national treasure, a thing of beauty, shaped by fire, a thing of power, born of water. Forged centuries ago by master swordsmith Masamune.
If it's a Masamune, it's almost like having crown jewels.
Proven in battle for centuries. Legend tells of a just blade, discerning and honorable. It was venerated as the hereditary sword of power by the ruling shoguns. Passed from generation to generation for 700 years. But in the aftermath of the Second World War, it disappeared.
It is the vanished embodiment of Japanese tradition and an object of great desire.
Records tell us a mysterious US sergeant took it to be destroyed. But some say he saved it and took it home to America. Now worth millions of dollars, experts believe it may still be out there.
I still somehow feel that it still does exist, possibly unrecognized.
This is the story of the ancient legendary Honjo Masamune, lost sword of the samurai. In the late 13th century, the rulers of Kamakura province near Tokyo had a serious problem. The invading Mongol hordes of Kublai Khan. Under the onslaught, their weapons simply weren't up to the task.
When the Mongol invasion happened, Japanese swords were nice, slender, beautiful-looking things, but they broke on the Mongol armor.
To solve this problem, they turned to swordsmith Honjo Masamune. Masamune's task was to redesign the Japanese sword to withstand the armor and kill the Mongol invaders. Masamune developed techniques that have never been surpassed. First, Masamune beat red-hot high-carbon steel into a thick rectangular billet. Then cutting and folding it again and again, he forged a blade composed of over 30,000 layers. To the thick back edge and the thin cutting edge, he gave very different properties. And these were born not from the heat of the fire, but how the steel cooled in water.
The cutting edge, because it hardened quickly, is very, very hard, almost as hard as glass, but it's brittle.
The thicker, heavier back edge gave up its heat more slowly. This changed the structure of the iron itself, making it far less hard but more flexible than the vulnerable sharp edge.
The back, because it cooks slowly, is tough and malleable, and it supports and stops that brittle edge cracking.
In battle, the thin edge was used defensively to cut. It is rigid and razor sharp, and the back used defensively as a shield. Its flexible spine absorbing impact. But to withstand the Mongol armor, Masamune also made his blades broader from edge to back for strength, the point longer to pierce, and the hardened edge deeper to aid repair. And so, Masamune brought the samurai sword to the peak of perfection, exemplified by the Honjo Masamune. Not just a weapon, but a work of art, an object of beauty. And Masamune's name still resonates throughout Japan today.
He's known to school children in Japan. They might know nothing else about Japanese swords, but his name is known.
Over the centuries, many legends have grown up about the great Masamune and the magical qualities of his swords. One of Masamune's pupils thought that after many years' training, he had surpassed his master. To test the quality of their respective blades, they suspended them in a stream. The student's blade was so sharp that it cut leaves and twigs, everything in its path. Masamune's blade, just as sharp, cut nothing. The student claimed victory, but a bystander disagreed. He observed that Masamune's blade did not cut needlessly. It was discerning and honorable, a just blade.
Masamune is generally given the titles Goro Nayudo, which have Buddhist implications, suggesting he was of the priesthood, or at least a devout follower of Buddha.
His finest work, the Honjo Masamune, was primarily a weapon for cutting human flesh. And the samurai would develop a very practical method for testing blades.
For a fee, an official tester would use a blade on a corpse from the execution grounds and report back to the owner on how it cut and how it behaved and how many bodies and which particular part of the body to cut.
The edge was sharp and the back strong, but yet another key property made the sword so deadly: its curve.
Swords were made curved because they cut flesh better when they're curved. There's a slicing action that's automatically built into the cut.
There are diagrams which show the various cuts that were tested.
The easiest was to chop through a wrist or an ankle. The most difficult would be through the pelvic girdle or the shoulder girdle, and diagonally down through the rib cage, cuts like that.
As a permanent record, the test results would be carved into the sword's tang under the mounted grip.
It shows that these swordsmiths had great concern, not only just for the look of their swords, but of the effectiveness of their swords.
History doesn't record precisely when Masamune drew from his furnace the greatest blade he ever made, the Honjo Masamune. Around the year 1300 is the closest anyone can say. Nothing is known of its early life or battles, who wore it proudly in his belt, or who inherited it over the centuries. Such a fine sword would have played an important part in the rigid social structure of feudal Japan, in which everyone knew their place.
At the top was the shogun, who was if you like, a military dictator. Below him would be various large landowners.
The powerful landowning lords, the daimyos, were protected by the knightly class, the samurai. The name literally means one who serves.
The soul of a samurai is to serve. The soul of a samurai is to wait. The soul of a samurai is to follow his lord, until such time as his lord may want him.
The sword was an essential part of a samurai's dress, the uniform of his class. The long sword was a large part of who he was.
The sword was something more than just a weapon. It was his most prized possession. It was described as the soul of the samurai.
The sword was an important thing for the samurai because it was their badge of rank. It was their status symbol, if you like.
Just as a samurai's life belonged to his lord, lives of those with a lower rank, farmers and peasants, belonged to him.
The samurai were allowed to cut down anybody without any excuse. If you insulted me and you were a peasant, I could just cut you down and that was it.
The Honjo Masamune first enters recorded history when, 300 years after it was made, it got its name. In the 16th century, in battle, General Honjo Shigenaga was attacked by an enemy with Masamune's masterpiece. The sword had already claimed a number of trophy heads that day, but General Honjo Shigenaga prevailed, and finally victorious took the sword as his prize. From then on, it bears his name, Honjo Masamune. Soon afterwards, General Shigenaga was ordered to Fushimi Castle. But short of money, he sold the now priceless sword for 13 large gold coins. At today's gold prices, around £2,500. It was now that the Honjo Masamune was transformed from a valued weapon to priceless symbol of absolute power. The superlative sword became the ultimate gift to pass up the social ladder to nobles of ascending rank as a token of esteem. Eventually, it was received in tribute by warlord Tokugawa Ieyasu. With the Honjo Masamune at his side, Tokugawa Ieyasu was about to change the course of Japanese history. Japan was being torn apart by civil war. Daimyo against daimyo, samurai against samurai, each fighting loyally for his lord to the death. Finally, in 1603, Tokugawa Ieyasu amassed enough military power to seize overall control. He made the emperor a mere figurehead. Ieyasu himself would rule all Japan as military dictator. He would be the shogun.
Japan was at war for 150 years between the 15th and the 16th centuries. And the great Tokugawa achievement is to make peace break out, if you like.
The Tokugawa shoguns brought 250 years of peace to Japan. And their ceremonial sword was the Honjo Masamune. Over the centuries, the hereditary sword of the shoguns was passed from generation to generation. Even after the Tokugawas fell from power in 1868, the great sword continued to be handed down within the aristocratic family into the 20th century. In 1939 in Tokyo, it was designated a Japanese national treasure, a survivor of 700 years of turbulent history. It was only in the upheaval of the Second World War that the mystery of the Honjo Masamune begins, when it disappeared. Japan entered World War II in 1941 with a surprise attack on the US Navy anchored at Pearl Harbor, Hawaii. As Japan poured millions of troops into battle, the High Command boosted recruitment and morale by fostering the ideals of Japan's ancient past, Bushido, the way of the warrior, and the heroic exploits of the samurai. So they gave out swords.
If you were recruiting people from backgrounds which had no military history whatsoever, the simple act of recruiting them, giving them a sword, or allowing them to wear a sword and carry a sword was, in a way, elevating them in status and giving them a pride.
Every officer, sergeant and corporal had to wear a sword as part of his uniform. The sheer number required was huge. So these modern military swords were not hand-beaten by master craftsmen in the traditional way.
A lot of swords made for officer class were mass-produced from pieces of steel, usually a piece of railway line. A lot were made in factories. All of the swords made for NCOs were mass-produced in factories from ordinary steel.
By the Second World War, there are estimated to have been as many as 2 million swords worn by the Japanese military. The symbolism of the sword continued to be promoted in Japanese propaganda throughout World War II. This pilot on the cover of Japanese propaganda magazine Front in 1943 carries his sword center frame as a symbol of honor, justice, and fighting spirit.
It's a very well-informed, very well-composed, highly artistic, and very effective image. But it's not true. This is not how pilots got into planes. This is staged. But samurai myths about sacrifice become very useful for steeling yourself before you are going to get into the cockpit of a plane in which you are probably going to die.
For the Japanese, war was a fight to the death. The emperor and the government could not countenance surrender. On August the 6th and 9th, 1945, American B-29 aircraft dropped a nuclear bomb on 2 Japanese cities, Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Just 6 days later, the Japanese had to bear the unbearable, think the unthinkable. They surrendered.
Across the radio comes the voice of the emperor, which nobody's heard before. And it's a very strange voice. It's a very high voice. It's a very weak voice. He's talking in a language that most of them don't understand. But the message is clear. We've lost.
At the end of the Second World War, the average Japanese person would have been totally devastated by having suffered defeat, a loss of face. But on the other hand, the war was over, and the hardship they'd been through, the firebombing, the starvation, was finished.
Not for the first time in Japanese history, the emperor had to move aside for a powerful shogun. Shogun is a very old title in Japanese history. It means not just military commander, but supreme dictator. And the man the United States sent to rule occupied Japan was certainly that. 5-star General Douglas MacArthur.
You get this tall, white American stepping out of an aeroplane in a very theatrical way. He's dressed very particularly, his collar is open, you know, and this is the new guy in town. MacArthur was a dictator, and he was the supreme commander. It's a time of chaos, and MacArthur's there to do a very particular job, and he's very aware of the job he's going to do. He's very charismatic, he's very savvy. There's a very famous photograph, for example, of MacArthur standing next to the Emperor in morning coat, looking incredibly formal. MacArthur again with the open shirt collar and towering over him. And of course it's a way of making a very profound statement.
MacArthur officially accepted the Japanese surrender in a ceremony aboard the USS Missouri in Tokyo Bay on the 2nd of September 1945.
It is my earnest hope, and indeed the hope of all mankind, that from this solemn occasion a better world shall emerge out of the blood and carnage of the past.
As soon as the surrender was signed, MacArthur, as Supreme Commander Allied Powers, set to work. He issued SCAP General Order No. 1. The immediate surrender of all Japanese armed forces. MacArthur demanded they cease hostilities and lay down their arms.
At the beginning of the occupation, though, there are two main objectives. The first, the urgent one, is demilitarization. You have to take the stuff away, you have to make sure they don't do it again.
MacArthur's plan was to make sure Japan could never wage war again. Total demilitarization and disarmament were paramount.
They destroyed a lot of, honest-to-God, modern military material, planes and so on and so forth. They also collected a lot of gunpowder, which of course has its uses. They just collected everything.
MacArthur soon destroyed hundreds of ships and thousands of planes. But what should he do with all those swords? Every Japanese officer, sergeant and corporal carried one at his side. There were millions of them, but MacArthur was determined to collect every one. Not because the swords were a military threat, but because of their enduring symbolic importance.
Certainly, taking away weapons is one way of demonstrating your authority. And of course, the sword is not, in the end, a weapon. It's a symbolic statement about authority. It's the thing that somebody would carry who was in charge. So to take the symbol of authority away is important.
All over the Pacific, surrender ceremonies were organized by the victorious Allies. On parade grounds in Sumatra, Burma, and Malaya, Japanese fighting men suffered the humiliation of surrendering their treasured swords to the Americans.
Your government, regarding military swords as weapons, does not acknowledge the wearing of swords as dress, and we have been ordered to surrender all kinds of swords. Japanese officers are extremely dejected and troubled.
What the Allies didn't realize was that some of the swords were not modern, mass-produced weapons, but handcrafted antiques of great value.
Some families at the beginning of the war who did own swords that had been in the family for many, many generations and possibly had been used in warfare in the distant past, took them to battle, having picked up a tradition that had been going on for centuries of carrying an ancestor's sword into battle.
Surrendering a venerable family heirloom was especially painful.
I cannot help heaving a deep sigh of sorrow in parting with my most beloved sword, my spirit, with which my ancestors went to war, and which my father himself handed over to me when I set out from home for this one, praying for my heroic victory in every action.
Hundreds of thousands of swords were surrendered, but what to do with them? Some were awarded to Allied officers or to civilians who had distinguished themselves in the war effort. To one, a crude, mass-produced blade, to another, perhaps a centuries-old work of art. The Americans didn't know or care. But most of the swords were not given away. They were destroyed. The SCAP instruction for disarmament applied not only to frontline soldiers, but the people of Japan at home too. Even swords in private hands. The Honjo Masamune in the Tokugawa mansion in Tokyo was no exception.
Collect and deliver all arms in the possession of the Japanese civilian population.
All of the swords in Japan were rounded up into centres, usually warehouses or school gymnasiums, and piled high ready for destruction.
The order to collect all swords meant just that. These seizures were indiscriminate. Family heirlooms decorating homes and masterpieces in collections were commandeered as quickly as military blades.
The people who were handling the swords, who were sweeping them up in the dragnet, were quite low-level functionaries, very hard-pressed for time, as low-level functionaries normally are. They're not colonels with an enormous amount of time on their hand. They don't know what they're dealing with.
The owners of swords were instructed to take them to collection points such as police stations. Even the aristocratic Tokugawa family, who as shoguns once ruled Japan, were not exempt. The SCAP instructions were law, and they were ordered to relinquish all their fine swords, including the legendary Honjo Masamune. In Japan, there was outrage. Would they really have to give it up to the Americans, who appreciated nothing of its history or symbolism? Influential people, collectors and museum curators, were soon complaining to SCAP about this assault on the Japanese heritage.
Very quickly they discover that there's blowback, if you like, that they are being indiscriminate and that they're annoying some people. Of course, they learn more very quickly. They learn that some people don't like having their swords taken away. They learn that there are collectors of Japanese swords who have nice collections, which got caught up in the dragnet.
A key figure in trying to save swords, like the Honjo Masamune, was Dr. Junji Homma of the Tokyo Museum. He met military police commander Colonel Victor C. Cadwell of the US 8th Army, the officer in charge of weapons collection. Dr. Homma explained that some swords were ancient works of an almost forgotten art, like the cathedrals of the West. A vivid symbol that was an extension of the samurai himself, influencing Japanese art and literature. Dr. Homma argued that they were not military weapons at all. Treasures like the Honjo Masamune were art swords.
It was people like Homma who coined the phrase of Japanese art swords in order to save them from destruction by the occupying forces.
It was essential they were preserved because they were part of Japan's historic artistic inheritance. Then this term art sword was devised.
Homma succeeded and convinced Colonel Cadwell that Japanese swords were not simply wartime weapons and should no longer be treated as such. SCAP Instruction 12 tried to clarify the situation.
You are advised that if these swords are the personal property of those officers concerned, they may be retained on condition that henceforth it will be understood that they have no military significance whatsoever, but are household treasures.
But Cadwell didn't have the final word. As late as November the 11th, 1945, contradictory orders were issued by SCAP.
All swords, including privately owned swords, shall be treated as symbols of militarism and destroyed.
As a result, valuable antique blades continued to be swept up.
Sadly, a lot of very fine traditional swords did go into the melting pot.
Some families protected their heirlooms by deceiving the Americans.
Certain families in Japan deliberately acquired what I can only describe as very poor quality swords and hid their better swords because they knew they were going to be taken by the victors.
But the Tokugawa family did no such thing. They took a very different, honorable course and accepted the latest edict from SCAP. Just before Christmas 1945, the last known owner of the Honjo Masamune, Tokugawa Ieyasu, a descendant of the shoguns, obeyed the law and delivered the family's swords to Majiro police station.
The family still does have ownership of it, and so they can do something useful, which is their duty. Because, of course, the symbolic value of the old military family of Japan, the first military family of Japan, giving up the symbol of their authority to the new occupiers in order that Japan can embark on a new path.
Tokugawa Ieyasu handed in 15 swords, bundled all together. And among them was the finest sword ever made, the Honjo Masamune. Mr. Tokugawa never saw the great family sword again. The Honjo Masamune disappeared and entered the realm of conjecture and mystery. The first clue to what became of the lost sword of the samurai appeared in New York 20 years after the end of World War II. The August 1966 edition of Saga, an American adventure and mystery magazine, contained an article listing Japanese national treasures that went missing after the war. The list of 14 swords included the Honjo Masamune. Here in black and white, it recorded that a Sergeant Cole D. Bymore of the 7th U.S. Cavalry had collected it from the police station at Majiro. But how reliable was this record? What is undoubtedly true is that the 7th Cavalry patrols were in Tokyo and did make inventories of all arsenals, factories, barracks, and storage depots. They also disposed of munitions and conducted patrols in search of hidden Japanese weapons, including swords. This corroborates the Saga magazine article. The next question is, did Sergeant Cole D. Bymore take the sword from the police station? Unfortunately, all police records for the period in question are lost. But there is another source, the Japanese Department of Education. Their records at the time make it clear that the Honjo Masamune certainly was taken from Majiro police station by Sergeant Bymore. But where did he take it? All over Japan, collected swords were piled high in warehouses before being dumped at sea or melted down for scrap iron. In Tokyo, for Sergeant Coldy Bymore, storage was at the Akabane depot. To avoid the destruction of art swords, every blade at Akabane was scrutinized by Dr. Junji Homa's inspection committee. It was a big success. Nearly 5,000 swords were identified as important cultural artifacts and returned to their owners. But the Honjo Masamune was not among them. Was it fed to the furnace and destroyed? Or did Coldy Bymore keep it for himself?
I think it's most unlikely that the Honjo Masamune sword did go into a melting pot. The Tokugawa, having been shoguns of Japan, and hence at the pinnacle of Japanese society, would have had some extremely fine swords. And I'm pretty sure that even the police in the local police station and the sergeant to which they were handed over to would have recognised the quality of the mountings, if nothing else. And therefore, I suspect they were shipped back to America pretty quickly.
What is certainly true is that the American Army operated an official war trophy system. A GI who had taken part in the Pacific War could, with the correct permission slip, take home one enemy gun and one sword as personal souvenirs. Most of these returning men were carrying mass-produced military swords, nothing special. But some GIs unknowingly had centuries-old works of art of great cultural and monetary value. It's very possible that the Honjo Masamune was taken by Coldy Bymore as his personal memento. If this was true, the question then became, when did Sergeant Bymore get shipped home? And did he carry the Honjo Masamune with him? At this point, the trail becomes even more obscured. 7th Cavalry records should reveal when Sergeant Coldy Bymore left Japan and when he arrived home. But the 7th Cavalry Veterans Association lists no one by that name. Does that mean there never was a Coldy Bymore? The facts are more complicated. The Saga magazine article contains another clue. It describes the name Coldy Bymore as phonetic. This indicates it's a translation from English into Japanese. The strange name Coldy Bymore may be inaccurate.
We're moving between languages. We're moving between languages fast on a busy day when there are 100 different things to do by somebody scribbling in a book. So when you hear the name that's come down to us, the first thing that comes to mind is, this isn't an American name. This is a problem of transliteration.
The Japanese have developed phonetic alphabets to help transcode English and other languages. The characters are not words, as in Japanese, but represent particular sounds. It is not precise.
In order to get the sergeant's name down, what the Japanese sergeant would have done would have been to write his name in a Japanese syllabary, an alphabet, but we call it a syllabary, because it's a way of transliterating English into Japanese.
This system of transliteration is far from perfect, as Japanese sounds don't appear in English, and English sounds have no Japanese equivalent. The name may not be Coldy Bymore, but something that sounds a bit like it.
If you think back to that moment when he wrote it down, it sounds something like Gorudi Baimor, or maybe Bimoru, and actually then transcribing back, because it went both ways. So maybe this is Goldie Beamer, maybe this is Cody, maybe this is Biltmore. God knows. When the American sergeant said, "Oh, my name's Goldie Beamer," the Japanese would have said Gorudi Bimaru, and then put it into these characters, which then come back to us in a scrambled form.
So was there a 7th Cavalry Sergeant in Tokyo on the 18th of January 1946 with a name similar to Coldy Bymore? Unfortunately, the scrap records of lowly sergeants have been routinely destroyed. The true name of the sergeant can never be found. But even so, many believe the Honjo Masamune could still turn up. In the years since the war, Americans began to understand the prestige and value of fine Japanese swords properly. President Truman was given a 650-year-old sword in a 350-year-old silk wrapping as a war souvenir. The Allied occupation of Japan continued until 1952, and the influx of swords to America after the Second World War was like a tsunami. For the handful of knowledgeable sword enthusiasts who recognized the characteristics which made a blade great, there was the opportunity to make a lot of money.
I could quite easily buy swords one day for £15 and sell them the next day for £300 or something, which is incredible sort of stuff.
Dealers discovered that hidden in the stream of confiscated weapons, there were historically important swords now scattered all over the US.
In America has still got thousands of swords stashed away in attics, box rooms, garages, which was brought back as trophies and are merely regarded as, oh, Grandad's old sword.
Could the Honjo Masamune be among Grandad's old swords? Since World War II, there have been thousands of ads placed in newspapers all over the US offering to buy Japanese swords. These were the days when a fine collection could still be acquired very cheaply.
In America, especially over the 1970s and 80s, I've heard it termed as the gold rush over there. And people were making fortunes buying, selling swords, and mostly selling them back to Japan.
As this market developed, some important art swords did occasionally turn up. Avid collector Clive Sinclair came by a sword when it surfaced in just this way. Wonderfully preserved, it was made especially for the Shogun's chief test cutter.
It turned up in an antique fair, swapped hands for £400. Within half an hour, it's got up to £1,500. And I paid £10,000 for it. And I've spent another £3,000 on it since then. And it's been exhibited in Japan. It's a very good sword.
Could this one day happen to the Honjo Masamune? If it did emerge from someone's attic, how could it be recognized? There is a telltale way of knowing. 700 years ago, when Masamune plunged the hot blade into cold water, he gave birth to a razor-sharp weapon. But he also gave the Honjo Masamune a unique signature.
If a sword turned up that was claimed to be the Honjo Masamune, because it was a national treasure, prior to the war there were very, very accurate drawings made of its shape, the patterning of the hardened edge, which you could use to compare a sword with, to say, yes, it's the same, or no, it isn't.
For centuries, it was customary for an artist to meticulously draw the unique pattern on the edge of a fine sword, the hamon. When in 1939 the Japanese declared the Honjo Masamune a national treasure, such fine detailed drawings of the hamon were made. If the Honjo Masamune ever appeared at an antiques fair or auction, there could be no mistake. Its fingerprints have been taken.
At this point, perhaps the best way of understanding the meaning of that sword is as an artistic object. So it's made by a famous maker, and it has fabulous provenance. If you go to an auction house today, you need something with provenance. You need to know which hands it's passed through.
But any lucky finder in the US would face a catch-22. For a collector to be certain, for its identity to be official, the Honjo Masamune would have to be sent to Japan for shinsa, a rigorous examination by Japanese experts.
The problem with that is, if you live in America and you own this sword and you send it to Japan for shinsa, they won't allow it to be exported again. So you've actually got to give it back to Japan, basically, to get it verified.
So, if anyone did find it, they would have every incentive to keep it secret, for fear of losing it. Whatever the case, the whereabouts of the Honjo Masamune remains a complete mystery to this day. Anyone trying to trace it faces huge obstacles. The few clues there are sparse. The identity of the elusive cavalry sergeant is still a mystery. Precisely what happened that day at the Majiro police station may never be known. If only we had the paperwork, a signature, the Honjo Masamune might yet be found. It's one of the ironies of this story that the Honjo Masamune needn't have been handed in at all. If the Tokugawas had only waited just a few months until the law was changed, they could have kept it.
Maybe even 6 months later, it would have been protected. It would still be there. It would probably be somewhere deep in a vault in the Tokyo National Museum. The Honjo Masamune would have become, again, firmly, finally, a national treasure, a national property put on show for the people of the new nation, not as a weapon, as a work of art.
There is another irony. Because it is lost, the Honjo Masamune has been transformed from a historical artifact to a thing of legend.
Maybe the most important fact about this sword is that it's lost. A thing that no longer is there, or a thing that you've never seen, is much more powerful than one that you have close at hand.
The legend will only ever grow stronger until more evidence can establish where it is or whether it has been destroyed.
Unless we see its corpse or something, we'll never know, will we? I mean, unless we see its broken tang or something, we'll never know.
Anyone with a love of Japanese swords can never give up hope.
I still somehow feel that it still does exist, possibly unrecognised, somewhere.
Things usually turn up when somebody dies and heirs go in and discover objects. It could still turn up. If it did, it would be a media spectacle.
It would be wonderful if somebody could find that sword.
While a treasure such as the Honjo Masamune remains lost, stories will be told of its possible location, and people will dream of it, hunt for it. The lost sword of the samurai.